people, so many of them, are so convinced that after the 7th of October, Israel has the right to do whatever it wants without limits. No moral limits, no legal limits, nothing.
You an Israeli, you obviously have kids who live in Israel. What do you think is the future of the society going to be like?
If in Israel of 2025, to maintain a coalition, you need to kill dozens and hundreds and thousands and maybe tens of thousands of more Palestinians in Gaza.
What did you think Israel will be like in 2025 when you were working in 1979 for Shimon Peres?
We were told on a systematic basis that we are the David and the Arabs are the Goliath. The question should be, what kind of Israel will be in 50 years, and who wants to live in such an Israel?
Is there anything else you wanna say? Something I may not have asked you, which you think is relevant?
I don't think that there is anything you didn't ask in 1 hour and 10 minutes.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq Carim, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking to Gideon Levy. Gideon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashfaaq. I'm very happy to be with you.
Gideon won't be a stranger to many of our viewers. Gideon Levy's been a journalist and a columnist for Haaretz for decades. Before that, he actually started off his career as a spokesperson for Shimon Peres before reporting in the West Bank and the occupied territories. His journalism has been very brave and very divisive, at least in Israel. So Gideon, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
It's going to be a long discussion, as usual. We're going to be speaking about, obviously, Israel's latest escalation in Gaza, what's driving that and what the repercussions for that will be. But we're also going to be looking back at the last 16 months, Israeli society's response to what's occurring, why that's happening. We're going to be talking about the future of Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. And we're also going to be touching a little bit about you and your journey and how your own perceptions have changed and your observations sort of throughout your career. So yeah, it's really a pleasure to be speaking to you again.
Thank you.
Just to start us off with, so just 2 days ago, Israel again unleashed a lot of hell on Gaza. This is after 16 days of starvation, 400 people killed, 180 children. What do you understand? I mean, it's been suggested, and probably rightly so, that this is a power play by Netanyahu to kind of keep the coalition together, his ruling coalition together. What's your views on that? And is there more to it than just keeping the coalition together?
Yeah, there is more to it, because behind this, and people tend to ignore it, behind this, a very dangerous and sick ideology is hidden. Because if in Israel of 2025, to maintain a coalition, you need to kill dozens and hundreds and thousands and maybe tens of thousands of more Palestinians in Gaza, so something is much more thick than, those talking about maintaining the coalition. No, the name of the game is that killing Palestinians becomes a tool for all kinds of political purposes. And I really don't know how Gaza can stand it one more time. I mean, those people who we see now running away on their lives in long envoys, no idea where to run and where is a safe place. What more will those people suffer in their life only to satisfy some sick, crazy sentiments of some Israelis?
I mean, we are speaking about keeping the coalition together. I mean, and you rightfully mentioned that it's kind of a sick gesture that people need to do this, but there may be viewers out there who aren't familiar with the mechanics of just how this works. So can you just run us through what me and you assume the viewer already knows, just how this attack keeps Netanyahu's right-wing coalition together, and then we'll examine it further.
This is a coalition of Netanyahu's party, the Likud, the biggest party, with some right-wing fascist small parties, without whom there is no majority in the parliament. One of those components left the coalition a few months ago, very few months ago, and say that he might come back to the coalition if the war will be renewed. Now, in 2 weeks, the budget should be approved in the parliament. If it's not approved, the government falls. And surprise, surprise, 2 weeks before it, Netanyahu renews the war, and Mr. Ben-Gvir is back on track, back in his office in the National Security Ministerium. And here you have the whole thing. I mean, as simple as this.
Okay, so there's one aspect that's just thanks for clarifying that for our viewers. Just the fact that Netanyahu is trying to keep his coalition together ahead of a budget speech, and Ben Gvir coming back. But there'll be cynics that out there that are saying that we always knew the ceasefire won't last. That Israel's, especially the far rights, and not just necessarily the far right, which we'll get to as well, their desire to now ethnically cleanse Gaza. This was flouted back in the day with Biden and Blinken when the genocide just started. It's already been expressed by Trump, who obviously also has allies with the Arab world who have rejected this notion. And so he's kind of hot on one day with the ethnic cleansing, on other days he's not so hot. But just speak us through that as well. I mean, yes, this is definitely a desperate move to keep the coalition together. But in your view, did you really think, did anyone really think that the ceasefire was going to be sustainable? Or was it just sort of given that at some point Israel's going to, as usual, try to break the ceasefire? And now that Gaza is in many ways a wasteland, there's not a lot of infrastructure, they'll push ahead with this agenda of making it very difficult for the Palestinians to live there.
Look, I don't know about others, but I kept on saying that Netanyahu will implement the first phase and will never implement the second and the third phase of the agreement. This was clear from day one. My only hope for a moment, but just for a moment, was that the new American administration will force him to do so, because this administration has the capability to force him. And I had really a stupid hope that they will do so. But very shortly later, I realized that this hope has no factual basis. And the Americans just gave Netanyahu the green light to do whatever he wants in Gaza. And here we are facing the renewal of the war. No hope, no surprise at all.
You've covered many of Israel's assaults on Gaza. Obviously, this one is very different. It also is after October 7th, which was also very different to any attack by Hamas on Israel. So, but I mean, even given all of that and given the scale of the attack on October 7th, are you surprised by just how violent Israel's response has been in the last 16 months?
No, I'm not surprised. And I'm even not surprised that the world let it happen. And I'm not surprised that the Americans were so impotent in preventing it. Don't forget that Donald Trump came to office only a few weeks ago. But all this war, there was this passive support of another administration, supposedly a more moderate one, a more liberal one, a more aware of human rights and international law. And all this was just hollow words. And Israel had the green light with the former administration, has it now, to go wild. In Israel, after the 7th of October, with justification or without it, there is no opposition to any kind of war, to any kind of atrocities toward the Palestinians, to any kind of bloodshed, as long as it is in Gaza or in the West Bank.
You've mentioned that the Israeli society, there's no opposition to war, right? Tell me more about that. I mean, is this just the case of Israeli society losing its moral compass? Is this a result of the educational institutions, propaganda, media control? How did Israeli society get there?
So it's the outcome of really years and years of indoctrination and the brainwash, mainly by the media, much more than the education system, because the media is also more effective in Israel. But in any case, we could see it happening because it's a process. It didn't start now. when you look backwards at all the wars that Israel launched against Palestinians or against others, there was always automatic support in the beginning. Many times later on, there was some opposition. But in the first phase, including the first Lebanese war and the second Lebanese war, which both were catastrophic, also from the point of view of Israel, the support was almost from wall to wall. Later on, there was an opposition. In Israel, it's much, much more popular to go for a war with justification, without justification, with legitimization, without it. Much easier in terms of public opinion to launch a war rather than to do a minimal step toward peace, toward equality, toward justice. This will always face an enormous objection in Israeli public opinion.
Just to sort of give us an insight into what Israeli society is like, you wrote a column recently about undocumented Palestinian workers who were hunted down effectively in a mall. They were in Israel working illegally, and there was almost a manhunt for them, and almost your article brings it out very, very much, how there was almost a spectacle and a bloodlust by patrons of the mall, by mall management, by the society on the whole, to kind of get at these Palestinians. And you wrote that you basically compared the Palestinians who are now, because you can tell us, you will tell us about this, but just to give our audience a perspective, since October 7th, Palestinians in the West Bank cannot go into Israel just to work as they were. So obviously they're in need of employment and money. And so you compared it to Jews sneaking out of the ghettos for food. Can you talk us through first what's happening to these workers and give us the extent of what the furor in the mall was all about? But secondly, the comparison you made. Just tell us about the comparison and why you invoked the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto.
Gaza is a ghetto, no doubt about it. And the West Bank, after the 7th of October, is a ghetto. Gaza is much worse ghetto. The West Bank has still some outlets toward Jordan, but no Palestinian from the West Bank can get into sovereign Israel, which means that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lost their jobs. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Palestinians in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in the West Bank, are living now 17 months without jobs, without any income, nothing, without any perspective, because it might last years now. With this government, they might keep it as a ghetto for many more years. And then desperation is so high that people just know that they are taking an enormous chance, but still they are sneaking into Israel illegally, only to get some days in work. And then when they are finding some jobs in a mall, for example, a new mall, the biggest mall in Tel Aviv, which was opened just 2 days before this incident, immediately are the good Israelis who call the police because they identify a Palestinian there. And immediately in front of the cameras, obviously, Israel is showing them being led to custody and later on to deportation and maybe staying in jail for a while, humiliating them, treating them as terrorists, while most of them have nothing to do with terror. We even have a term to call them Shabach, illegal worker. We don't even call them by names. We have this term like they were, I don't know what. By the way, I must remind you that they are illegal in what is supposed to be also their land. It's not like it's Puerto Ricans or Venezuelans who penetrate into the United States. Those are Palestinians who are still in old Palestine. And I would believe that their right over this land is equal, at least equal to the right of the Jews over this land. And none of them can be illegal, like a Jew cannot be illegal in the West Bank. A Palestinian shouldn't be illegal in Tel Aviv or elsewhere.
I mean, it's still hard to imagine because I mean, for people who live outside of Israel, like myself, because you've heard this, and I've been interviewing a bunch of people who say there isn't really an opposition to the war. We do see protests, and the protests are a lot more about hostages or they're about against the Netanyahu government, but not specifically anti-war protests. Can you just clarify for that? Is that your sentiment also, that there aren't really anti-war protests, and if so, how? Like, how did we get there? How did we get to a situation where there's a devastating war being launched, even if members of society are very angry, potentially justifiably angry over what happened on October 7th? How do we get to a situation where you've seen such a devastating war, and there are protests to free the hostages, there are protests against how Netanyahu is conducting himself and the government, but there isn't really anti-war protests? Just clarify if that is true, and then secondly, if it is, how did we get there?
So first of all, you say that we see a devastating war, but Israelis don't see it because the media avoid it from the Israelis. You don't see Gaza for the last 17 months. Israeli media is preoccupied day and night with the hostages, with the soldiers, with the Israeli victims, with the injured guys, with the families of the hostages, with the mourning, and nothing about Gaza. You don't see Gaza. So first of all, Gaza is out of the picture and out of the reality, and Israelis are very happy about it, obviously. They don't want to see Gaza. So maybe they somewhere in the back of their mind, they know that something terrible is going on there. But if you're not exposed to it, it's not the same effect. I just wrote a piece for tomorrow that, in the last 2 days, 400, over 400, almost 500 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. There's no echo to it in Israeli media, nothing. Just the hostages and the risk for the hostages. So first of all, it is avoided from Israelis to see it. But that's not the full story, because those who want to know can know. There are enough sources that could face us with what's going on in Gaza. There is no opposition to the war because opposition to the war might irritate most of those who are protesting. There is no opposition to war because there is no peace camp in Israel anymore, and mainly so after the 7th of October. The 7th of October, the damage that it created to Israeli society is much bigger than people can imagine, because it really ruined the last remains of a peace camp, the last remain of a left in Israel. People, so many of them, are so convinced that after the 7th of October, Israel has the right to do whatever it wants without limits. No moral limits, no legal limits, nothing. All Gaza are Hamas, all Gaza are Nukhba, all Gaza carries the responsibility for the 7th of October, and the 7th of October was almost a Holocaust. This is the mindset. And with this mindset, don't you dare to be against the war, because we don't want those people who are against the war or against the occupation or against the apartheid, because then the message will not come. It's very nice to protest against Netanyahu. It's very nice to protest in favor of releasing the hostages. You hardly pay any political price for it. You don't need any courage for it. All your peer group will support you. And let's put this controversial issue of containing this war and facing those atrocities and crimes, let's put it aside, because this might spoil the protest.
Given what you're saying about the furor that exists in Israel, and sort of the absolute bigotry, the non-empathy, the unwillingness to show a light from the media, I mean, the whole society almost moving in one direction towards fascism and bigotry and dehumanizing Palestinians who do inevitably share the land with them. What realistically does the future of Israeli society look like? Do you think there's a turning back moment? I mean, is this just going to go on? How will Israeli society live with its neighbors, with itself? You're an Israeli, you obviously have kids who live in Israel. What do you think is the future of the society going to be like?
I can't hide from you that it looks very bad right now. But, we say that the darkest part of the night is the one before dawn. And maybe, I don't know, I think that most of the damages are irreversible. And we see it until now in the last decades, that the young generations were always more radical, more religious, more fascist than the older generation. And this will definitely continue for the short run, because I see the spirit, the zeitgeist of the young generation now, it's much worse. It's going only for the worse and for the worse. Hatred toward Palestinians, dehumanizing them, demonizing them, reaches levels that we never faced before. So from this point of view, Israel is going to a very, very bad place. And many people are troubled by this. I'm not one of those who think that the question should be, will Israel exist in 50 years? Which is a common question in certain circles. I don't think it is a question. The question should be, what kind of Israel will be in 50 years, and who wants to live in such an Israel?
Given what you just said, and given that it's very difficult to see the society turning back, what do you think will be the fate of the Palestinians in Gaza in a year's time, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time? I mean, I think obviously the time frame is a marker, but it's also irrelevant to some extent. But how do you see Gaza recovering? Will it be recovering? I mean, I know these are speculations, but just given this marriage of what's occurring in the Trump administration, how the international community is largely silent about this. There's Netanyahu, as you said earlier on, is willing to, the society is happy that babies are being killed to keep a coalition together. And then you put all of that together with what you just said. What do you see the future of the people of Gaza being?
It's not only the people of Gaza, obviously, it's also the people of the West Bank. Yeah, because we don't put our attention to what's going on in the West Bank, but horrible things are happening there also under the cover of the war in Gaza. At least I know what will not be in Gaza, and here I'm very definite about it. It will not turn into a Riviera, and it will not be able, the idea of transferring the people of Gaza will never succeed. So no Riviera and no transfer. My real fear about the future of the Palestinians, not only in Gaza, also in the West Bank, is that gradually their fate will be very similar to the fate of the Native Americans. A forgotten minority who would live in some kind of Bantustans without any rights forever. I know that many people think that finally it will explode, finally justice will prevail, finally this struggle will get to some achievements and the Palestinians will get their rights. There are many precedents in history in which it was working. This is true. But there are also some examples, like the Native Americans and others, in which this struggle did not succeed. And there's no guarantee that their struggle will succeed, not for the short run and not for the long run. Finally, the world is criticizing Israel, is making Israel into a pariah state, but governments continue to support Israel, and above all, obviously, the Americans. And, the attention toward the Palestinians finally will end. It repeats itself. And people are sick and tired because it really repeats itself. Every few years, a brutal attack over Gaza, and then rehabilitation of Gaza, and then again destruction in Gaza and mass killing and genocide. In a certain stage, I'm very afraid that Gaza will be forgotten. And that's the worst that can happen to Gaza.
You mentioned earlier on that you believe that ethnic cleansing definitely won't succeed. Just tell us a bit more about that. Why do you think it won't succeed? Why do you think they won't be successful in being able to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians?
ethnic cleansing as a mass process. Ethnic cleansing is happening on a daily basis now in the West Bank, but those are very small scales. Ethnic cleansing in the way that Gaza will be emptied from its inhabitants, I don't see it happening. First of all, because there is no place that will be ready to absorb them. So where will they go? And secondly, it's by far too big to operate it. Neither Israel, even though the Americans can take part in it, and especially when there is no place to push them to. Because I don't see neither Jordan or Egypt agreeing by any means. I don't see them agreeing because the price will be too high for their regimes, both very fragile regimes. And therefore, I don't see it happening. But who knows? Maybe I'm naive and maybe it will take place. Right now, I see ethnic cleansing in the margins, in the southern part of Hebron, in the Jordan Valley, only very weak communities, the shepherd communities, which are expelled by the coalition between the settlers and the army, family after family, village after village, but it's very limited in scale. Finally, we are dealing with 5-6 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I don't see in 2025 or in 2030 a world which will let it happen.
I mean, you've painted a grim reality, but a very real reality, right? One where Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, more acutely in Gaza, are starved, are bombed and evicted. In case of Gaza, everyone's been evicted already. If they're going home now, they're going back to tents or rubble. But in the West Bank, there's still lots of evictions. There were 40,000 people just a week ago evacuated from refugee camps across the West Bank. Now, just hold that thought, but let's go back to when you started working in the 70s and 80s, and you were a spokesperson for Shimon Peres in 78 and 82, between those years. When you then were working for the government, and you probably, maybe your eyes weren't as open as they are now, but I mean, I think Israel was also a different place to what it is now. When you worked then, try to take us back into the mind of a young Gideon Levy who was working for the government, and what did you think Israel will be like in 2025 when you were working in 1979 for Shimon Peres?
So first of all, just a small correction. I never worked for the government because Shimon Peres then was the leader of the Israeli opposition, the leader of Labour Party, which was the biggest
Yep.
opposition, and was in power for so many years before and after. But in those years that I was there, it was not in the government, but in Labour, together with Shimon Peres, who was then already the head of the opposition, a former Minister of Defense, a Minister of Foreign Affairs, a Minister of Treasury, and many, many others. In any case, I was brainwashed like any other Israeli who was brought up here. I saw nothing. I remember maybe I was 20 when I first heard the word Nakba. Never heard about it. I was brought up as a good boy, Tel Aviv, like all my friends, almost all my friends. There were very, very few who saw reality differently. We were told, and on a systematic basis, that we are the David and the Arabs are the Goliath, that the Arabs have only one thing in their mind, and this is to push us into the ocean, all of us, all Jews in Palestine. We were sure that we are a people of peace because we say shalom each other, and the Palestinians and the Arabs are people of war because nobody told us that they say salam, the same shalom that we say. They don't love their children. They only were born to kill. This was the mindset. That we are the few ones, another lie, that we are the few ones, the weak ones, the small ones, and they are the strong ones, the Goliath. All this was told us by so many media, education system, families, and I was sure that that's the story, that's the narrative. And it was only after I worked with Shimon Peres and after I served in Israeli army radio station, when I joined Haaretz and I randomly started to go to the West Bank. And then I realized that the big story is a very hidden one. And then I decided to dedicate my career to cover the hidden story, the major story of the occupation.
I want to get more into sort of what it was like covering the occupation as a young journalist. But just before we go there, as this brainwashed person in the 90s, 80s working for Shimon Peres, what was your idea of what a future Israel society looked like? I mean, what was your? I mean, did you even, maybe you don't even think that far? But if I told you back, if I asked you back in 1980, in the year 2025, what do you think Israel is going to be? Like, how did you imagine it? What were your own aspirations for the state? What were the aspirations of the people around you? Maybe you didn't have specific aspirations for the state, but just what kind of a society did you think you were building? And is it what exists now, or was it something else?
No, it was totally something else. First of all, I believe that we can maintain a very liberal and human occupation. We really believe that you can have it all, to have an occupation and still to feel very good about ourselves. Being liberal, because I was a so-called leftist also then, but a Zionist leftist. And being Zionist doesn't go with being leftist, for sure not today. But then I didn't understand it. So there was the illusion that we can maintain a liberal occupation in which everyone will be happy, the Palestinians and the Jews. And then I was brainwashed that we are the best in everything. We have the best army and the best agriculture, and we are the lighthouse of the world, the chosen people. Those are all things that you get into your veins, that the whole world is just admiring Israel. And there were years in which it was true. And I even didn't ask myself, walking in Tel Aviv or elsewhere, when I saw all the ruins along the roads, I never asked myself, to whom are those ruins belonging to? And where are the owners of those ruins? What happened to them? I just heard, we were told that it was there were some Palestinians living here, and they were incited by the leaders to run away in 48. One big lie. Exactly like the lie that a people without a land arrive to a land without a people. The biggest lie of Zionism. I believed in all this. And I believe that Zionism is a liberation movement which should be supported by the entire world. And obviously, the Holocaust played also a very big role then. Don't forget that I was brought up a few years after the Holocaust. Israel was full with Holocaust survivors then. Our teachers were Holocaust survivors, our parents, our environment, our neighbors. It was all about it. And then people really had this fear that the Holocaust might come back, and this notion that after the Holocaust we have the right to do whatever we want. So this was the mindset, the zeitgeist.
So you in '82 you then joined. I think briefly you joined the army and worked in the radio corps of the army, and then you joined Haaretz, right? Is that, firstly, just clarify if that's correct, and secondly, did you leaving the army radio corps and going to Haaretz, did it have anything to do with the Lebanese war? Or was that just you were a journalist and you needed to now work for an outlet? Like, how did you end up working for Haaretz?
No, the timeline is a little different. First, I was in the army radio station. Then I worked with Shimon
There
Peres,
we go.
and then I came to Haaretz. Nothing to do with the Lebanese war. And I don't remember myself being very troubled by the Lebanese war. I was still stuck in the old beliefs.
And so what kind of made you venture out as a young journalist into the occupied territories, into the West Bank? And maybe anecdotally, just give us some of the anecdotes and stories you came across which kind of opened your eyes. People you may have met, things you may have covered. Was it gradual? Just kind of give us a sense of that journey.
It was so gradual, and it is still gradual until this very moment. It is still a process. I still change. I still open up. It started with a very innocent phone call of a friend who was then member of parliament of a leftist Zionist party, small one, Meretz, who told me, let's go to the West Bank. I heard that there were some olive trees being uprooted by settlers. Let's go and see it. And we went, and I made a story about it. And I guess a few weeks later, I went again back to the West Bank, while most of the Israelis never been there. And it was another story of some kind of atrocity. The second story I don't remember, but the first one I remember very well. And then gradually I realized two things. That first of all, there's no one to tell the story, and so almost no one. And secondly, that's the story that defines Israel, much more than anything else. The occupation defines Israel, not the kibbutzim, and not the achievements, and not the scientific achievements, and the high tech, and all those things that should be really a source of pride. I don't say no. But finally, what defines us is the occupation, and the occupation is not being told to the Israelis.
You mentioned that the process is ongoing and was all ongoing. So just to kind of capture what that process must be like. So when the first Intifada broke out in 1987, where were you in your process then? What did you make of the Intifada? Did you see the justification on the Palestinian side for the Intifada? Did you think it was reckless violence while you had some sympathy for the Palestinians? What did you make of the Intifada when you were back then?
Not yet. I was still, 87, it starts in the end of 87. I didn't start yet my journey to the occupation. It started in 88.
Okay, so it was the Intifada that kind of spurred that journey to some extent.
Exactly. But the beginning was, they have some case, but they do terrible things. And I didn't feel that my heart is with them. Not yet. This came much later. But the beginning is really, as I say, hesitating. And I know how it developed. It took years and even decades until I reached the point in which I separated myself from Zionism. I even separated myself from the two-state solution. This happened many, many years later.
What was the moment for you, when you said when your heart changed, when your heart was with them? What was that moment when your heart changed? And if you can remember it, you maybe you remember it very vividly, or maybe it was gradual. But is there a moment that you remember? This is my heart now is with, the victims in this big scheme, with those who are occupied and not with the occupier.
I remember once, and I don't remember where, standing with Palestinian protesters, and in front of us were the armed soldiers who shot gas and then also live ammunition. And all of a sudden, now the soldiers are the sons of my friends, the friends of my sons. They are a few meters in front of me. They speak my language. They are my people, my religion, everything. But I remember this moment in which I felt that, no, my heart is with the people. I stand now together with those people, against those people. This was a moment which was very meaningful for me. There were others, but this was the most meaningful moment in which I stood with the Palestinian protest against the military of Israel.
Do you remember? Do you remember sort of a year what year this was, plus minus?
No, it should be the late 80s.
Okay, so it's very soon after you start
Very
writing
soon,
stories
yeah.
about olive trees.
Yeah.
And then I guess the process is still ongoing, but it's more nuanced and refined then.
And then just let me interrupt you.
Please
Then
do.
came the happy years of Oslo in the 90s, in which I was on the 7th heaven because I was sure that we are going for peace. I had really this illusion, and there were so many signs that we're going for peace. And Arafat came, and the PA, and So those years, I was very, very happy that it's coming to its end. And it was obviously for me much easier. And again, I was caught by the trap like many others that Oslo leads us to peace. I was very much in favor. I was really in euphoria. There were all those peace conferences with Palestinians all over Europe. I went with Marwan Barghouti and others to Europe together to celebrate the peace. It was very clear that that's it. It's over. And then came the big disillusion.
What in your view is what blew up Oslo? I've had this conversation many times, and usually it's Arafat made a mistake. He sort of underestimated the Zionist ambitions to continue with settlements. He was kind of hoodwinked. He was fooled. And then obviously Netanyahu came to power in '96. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. I mean, is that the essence of what went wrong, or do you think it's much more nuanced than that?
First of all, the real trap was really ignoring the settlements, which is the core issue and the main obstacle. And nobody realized it then, including not the Palestinians. The fact that Israel was not ready even to freeze the settlement project, even not to freeze, showed its real intentions. Because if you have a real genuine intention to enable a Palestinian state, you don't build another terrace in the settlements. Okay, you don't want to dismantle them yet. Okay, but you don't build more. Ever since Oslo, in the 20 years later, we tripled the number of settlements. Tripled. And then much more than tripled. So this was one thing. And the other thing was that finally, no one really looked upon the Palestinians as equals. Not Rabin and Peres, at Arafat in person, all those expressions of how disgusted they were by him and how hard it was for them to shake his hands. He shouldn't shake their hands. They had much more blood on their hands, Palestinian blood, than he had of Jewish blood. But all those things didn't cross my mind then. I just saw a state being created which will live in peace with Israel and will be equal in its rights with Israel. What went wrong was the lack of understanding that they deserve at least what the Jews deserve in this part of the world. There was no one that I know in Israeli government who really perceived them as equal human beings.
So you're saying every successive Israeli regime, irrespective of who was in power, was just always trying to disrupt Oslo.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you more than this. The fact that Rabin was assassinated, in my view, was a terrible tragedy, obviously, and I liked Rabin and I had some personal relations with him, and I was shocked like anyone else. But historically, it didn't change much.
Okay, so there's two things now I want to speak about, which is kind of your. I mean, we've talked about your journey, but obviously that journey has aspects of isolationism, right? Because as you getting more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, as you seeing firsthand, discovering what kind of conditions they're living in. Obviously, not everyone around you is going through that process. Some are becoming even more right. Some are maybe becoming slightly sympathetic. But then there's the general public, but there's also your peers and journalists, right? So firstly, what was it like as you changing, just dealing with the general public, with family, with extended family, and then also dealing with journalists? Obviously, journalists also have a wide spectrum. There's people who write for very far right sort of publications, but Haaretz has generally been, left and liberal. What was that journey like, both with journalists and with the general public?
It went through many ups and downs. And I can tell you that the last 17 months, namely ever since the 7th of October, are the hardest ones ever. I was never so lonely like now. My best friends, or almost all of them, not all of them, but most of them, left me or left our ideas. You don't know how deep it is, the shift in Israeli peace camp in those months. Because also that the victims of the 7th of October were mainly from the peace camp. This is very meaningful. Would it be settlers? I guess it would be different, but it was really the core of the Israeli peace camp, which was attacked on the 7th of October. But throughout the years, there were ups and downs. I had bodyguards in 2014. I celebrated in the Oslo years, which were very happy years, and then being a supporter of the Palestinian was very fashionable, and going abroad to all those conferences together with the Palestinians was wonderful. And then really those were very sweet years. The others were harder, but always I had Haaretz as a rescue place, as a place who always supported me, and this must be said. Without Haaretz, I couldn't do it. No way. In no other media outlet I could do what I've done, if not Haaretz. The publisher, mainly the publisher, who always supported me. The atmosphere toward me was not always very supportive in Haaretz either. There were many who criticize me, who don't like my even presence there. One of the owners of Haaretz, a Russian oligarch who owns 25%, even wrote a letter to our publisher in the beginning of this war, now calling to fire me and Amira Haas. So even Haaretz was always something that I had to struggle, but the atmosphere was always very supportive and very friendly and loving, and I can only be grateful for Haaretz and for the platform, which is a very important platform because it is published in both languages, English and Hebrew, the only outlet which is in both languages simultaneously. And this was my opening to the world. Without the English version, I don't know what would have been, because in Hebrew, really, my readers are getting less and less.
You've mentioned Haaretz, and in 2014 you had to use bodyguards. This was mainly for your coverage of Israel's war on Gaza back then. I'm assuming. It's also said that Haaretz then lost millions of dollars in advertising revenue. Also, the targets because of you. And you did mention the publisher has been supportive of you. Why has Haaretz put up with you?
Look, it's first of all, it is part of the DNA of Haaretz, even though Haaretz defines itself as a Zionist newspaper until today, and so does the publisher. Insists on this, while I don't consider myself as a Zionist anymore. But that's part of the DNA, and I guess it is really thanks mainly to the publisher, who thinks that documenting the occupation is really a very important job, and he is very proud that his newspaper is the only outlet, almost the only outlet, which covers the occupation as it does. And it's also the combination of people who work in Haaretz, who most of them, not all of them, but most of them are real liberals. And somehow I made my way through Haaretz. And as I said, there were better years and worse years. For many years, I was very wanted on Israeli TV and other outlets. I even participate in some reality shows. I mean, I can't complain that I was always excluded, but in the last 1.5 years, I'm totally excluded.
You mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned right now that you've been excluded for the last 1.5 years, and that the last 1.5 years has really been difficult. You've lost close friends. Has this been the most hopeless you've felt in terms of what the Israeli society is, what the Israeli state is, where they're heading, just in terms of, is this rock bottom in terms of what you've seen, or has there been worse moments?
Definitely, undoubtedly. It was never so bad because there was always a camp which stood against, or at least I thought there is a camp. When I look backwards, I start to have my doubts how solid was this camp. But there was a camp, and now there is nothing. There's only opposition to Netanyahu. There's only protest calling to release the hostages, and nothing but this. For tomorrow I wrote, there are 24 living hostages in Gaza, and their fate is really touching, and Israel should do any possible effort to release them. But I cannot ignore 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza, part of them in worse conditions or not in better conditions for sure. And I cannot say that it's all about the hostages, while everyone around me is busy only with the hostages. No, with all due respect, there are some others living in Gaza in horrible conditions, under terrible fear, with terrible losses, with destruction, with no homes, with no future, with no present, with no food, with no medicines. How can we ignore this?
How has Haaretz changed in the last sort of 18 months? And I mean, you don't have to name people, etc. But are there young Gideon Levy's and Amira Hassas coming through? I mean, obviously the atrocities of the last 18 months, which Haaretz does cover, unlike most Israeli media, surely is conscientizing journalists in your newsroom. Or is there, I mean, I guess it does both, right? I guess there's also journalists who are caught up with sort of the revenge in society that's kind of built up because of October 7th. But how has Haaretz itself changed? And do you think the future of the paper is going to kind of maintain what it has maintained? How do you see it changing?
I don't think Haaretz changed. And I'm very happy about it. Haaretz didn't change. It kept still its Zionist side, but I think Haaretz played a very important role in this war, being the only outlet which tells Israelis what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I don't feel a change within Haaretz. There is a personal change. Some of my friends changed their views, but it didn't make a big difference in terms of my freedom, which was kept totally also in this war, totally. And I can only be grateful for this and not take it for granted that it will be forever. And I think Haaretz will continue to keep its DNA if the publisher will stay as long as we can, and if his replacement, he's 80 already, and there is always a fear that the new guys, whoever will it be, will change the DNA of Haaretz. This will be a catastrophic event, not only for me as a writer, but also for me as a reader and for me as an Israeli, because I truly believe that Israel will be a much worse place without Haaretz.
We've already touched upon, and you said you weren't surprised by the world reaction to the genocide in Gaza and what's occurred. But you also did mention that it seems like societies and global society are now treating Israel like a pariah, but governments are not. Specifically, governments in Europe and very much so the government in the USA. What do you think is at the essence of US and Western support for Israel? Is it white supremacy? Is it the Israel lobby? Is it, interests in the Middle East? When you look at this from as a journalist inside of Israel, close to the Israeli society, what do you think is the essence of the support that they have for Israel, and why they do so much to kind of, they smear their own names so badly to protect Israel? Why do they do this?
So it's a combination of things, and after we will mention all the factors, I will still tell you that there is something missing which I can't explain. If the President of the United States, not the current one, the former one, Joe Biden, who supplied Israel with so many weapons, with so much political, diplomatic, and economical aid, more than any country in the world, if he asked the Prime Minister of Israel not to penetrate into Rafah, and the Prime Minister of Israel just ignores him, and there are no consequences after it, nothing. The arms continue to flow, the money, the vetoes in the Security Council, everything continues as if nothing. None of my explanation will be good enough to explain a situation in which such a superpower like the United States can really swallow such, and it's just one example. There are so many others in which Israel just ignored the United States. So in Europe, it's a lot of guilt feelings, obviously, which are manipulated by Israel for its own interests in a very cynical way, labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. And it's very efficient. Europe right now is paralyzed, at least the establishment. Everyone is so scared to be labeled as an anti-Semite. When a Jew is being scratched somewhere, you see all the leadership running there. At the same time, there might be other minorities who suffer from more. You will not hear a word. But okay, the past is still, the shade of the past is still over Europe, and maybe rightly so. In the United States, it's really the Jewish lobby, obviously, which is very, very powerful, as we all know. And it's not only powerful, it's also very sophisticated. They know their way to manipulate, to really squeeze politicians in all kinds of ways. In any case, as I said, it's a combination of many things. Yes, it is also like South Africa was the white outpost against the communists and the blacks in Africa, apartheid South Africa. Israel is portrayed as so-called the only democracy in the Middle East. They always speak about shared values with Israel, which make me wonder so many times because Israel is maintaining one of the most brutal and cruel regimes in the world, one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world, namely the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. How can this country be labeled as a democracy and being such a darling of the West, sharing values with Israel? But yeah, not everything is still clear to me, because having said all this, Europe and the United States could continue to put all this aid and all those efforts to guarantee Israel. But if they would be more serious, they could have do it in a more conditioning way, and they don't do it.
And you're saying it's a mystery as to why they don't do that.
There is one part which is missing. Yeah, it's not total mystery, because as I say, there are the guilt feelings.
Yeah.
But still, it doesn't explain the intensity of it.
It's difficult, obviously, to cast judgment on the people that your government is occupying, on the Palestinians. But just in which way have Palestinian leaders, both on the Fatah side and on the Hamas side, in which way have they failed Palestinians in terms of somehow having the path to Palestinian liberation slightly better? Because, I mean, it's never been optimistic. It's never really been great. But just materially, not in terms of aspirations and passion and public opinion, but just materially, it always seems to be getting worse. Is that a fault of Palestinian leadership in your opinion, or not? I mean, what's your take on that?
I'm usually accused that I never blame them for anything, and people even say that that's racism, because I think that they cannot take responsibility for anything. But the truth is that I think they tried everything, and they had no chance. They are by far too weak, and they are fighting against huge powers, and they are too weak. Yes, if they had a better leadership, for sure now. But I thought that Yasser Arafat was a real leader. He made some mistakes, and Oslo was one of them. But finally, he united the Palestinian people. The big failures came after him, when there was no leadership, there was a vacuum. And I don't think I can blame the Palestinians much because they really tried everything. Okay, so the armed struggle didn't bring them any achievements. Okay, but the diplomatic struggle didn't bring them any achievement either. So they tried here and they tried there and nothing succeeded. And finally, they are, by the end of the day, too weak, too isolated. Also, the division that Israel created, by all means, Israel created this horrible division between Israeli Palestinians and Palestinians of the occupied territories, between Jerusalem and the West Bank, between Gaza and the West Bank, between the diaspora outside and diaspora inside, endless divisions, which also made it much weaker, obviously. I'm sure they carry some responsibilities, but once you start to speak about it, you create a symmetria. Both parties carry the same responsibility. No, Israel carries the main responsibility for the reality today.
What do you think, realistically, it would be the biggest driver for Palestinian freedom, aspirational Palestinian freedom? Does it depend on dynamics in Israeli society? Is it internal sort of leadership of the Palestinians? Is it the region shifting, maybe Arab countries being more representative and free, a global shift in power towards China? Like, what do you think is the most reasonable path towards a Palestinian dignity and equality and freedom?
Unfortunately, very little depends on them. Uh, Obviously, phenomena like Hamas and Jihad do not help to improve their image in the world, but I'm sure that would they have another leadership, a more moderate one, it wouldn't help much, it wouldn't change much. By the end of the game, I'm a great believer of putting pressure on Israel, not on the Palestinians, making Israel pay, making Israelis pay, making Israelis accountable for what's being happening, and believing that then and only then Israelis will start to ask themselves all kinds of questions. Until then, when Israel can continue being quite a good place, now we are in war and things are not so good, but life in Israel is very good. And as long as life in Israel is so good, why would Israelis bother to go for any change? So I'm still a believer of pressure. I don't see pressure over Israel, obviously. I don't see any other way to change things because Israelis will not wake up one shining morning and say, oh, this occupation is so ugly, let's put an end to it. Never. This will never happen. It will only happen when there will be no other choice. And to create this, you need to put pressure over Israel.
When we look at history, the Crusaders were also occupiers. They had a very confrontational relationship with the inhabitants of the local inhabitants of Palestine. They faced lots of resistance, and eventually, they were made to leave. They were given the option, but they left. They left the land. Do you see Israel? Do you see this sort of a similar situation with that? Do you think it's fundamentally different? We do live 900 years, into the future since then. So this is a very different world we're living in. But Israel seems, what you're saying, also seems that there's going to be a consistently sort of antagonistic relationship with the Palestinians, with the region. What do you think the fate will be in the long arc of history?
I don't think it will be a similar fate to the Crusaders because in the last 70, 80 years, there was a Israeli people created here, a real people with a lot of common ground. Not only religion, it's culture, it's language, it's everything. It's a real people. I mean, Israelis are a people today. I don't know if being Jewish is belonging to a religion or to a people, but being Israeli is belonging to Israel. And it's quite deep rooted. And I don't see this project being dismantled. as I said before, the question is how will it look? But it is here to stay, and I don't see anyone removing Israel from here.
What is your hope for your grandchildren? What kind of Israel and Palestine do you hope that they will live in when they are fully grown adults and old men like yourself?
Most Israelis will tell you my hope for my grandchildren is that they will leave. You will hear it for sure in my circles. Many of them will tell you, listen, there is no future here. It's not that it will not exist, but it will be an unbearable place, not only because of the Palestinians, because of the ultra-Orthodox, because of all the clashes between so many segments of the Israeli society, because of the aggression in daily life within Israel. So many will tell you they wish this. Look, my dream is a one democracy between the river and the sea, obviously, with equal rights to everyone. Right now, it sounds very far-fetched and without any chances, but I don't know any other vision. So if I have the luxury of dreaming, my dream is that my grandchildren will live in a democracy between the river and the sea.
Gideon Levy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Is there anything else you wanna say? Something I may not have asked you, which you think is relevant?
I don't think that there is anything you didn't ask in 1 hour and 10 minutes. And I want just to thank you for the very, very interesting and challenging conversation we had.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gideon Levy, and we will be in touch. Thank you for your time, and best of luck with everything.
All the best.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.